One of the biggest barriers to ecological connectivity is roads. In this video, we will look at the impacts roads have on ecosystems and some of the ways that their impacts can be mitigated. In this video, we will be drawing a lot on the science of road ecology, which is the study of the ecological effects of roads. Road ecologists are concerned with both the more local effects of roads, such as noise from traffic, water pollution, chemical runoff, and local air quality, but also the broader, more far-reaching effects of roads, such as habitat fragmentation, ecosystem degradation, and climate change. And road ecologists have plenty to study. Worldwide, roads are one of the most ubiquitous features on the landscape and one of the surest signs of human presence. Roads have been instrumental in connecting human populations and support a vast network of human movement and trade, but for the most part, their effects on the other species of this planet have been less positive. In particular, they have fragmented ecosystems around the world, reducing ecological connectivity. Although about 80% of the Earth's terrestrial surface remains roadless, this area is broken into about 600,000 patches, more than half of which are less than 1 square kilometer, shown here on this map in red. And of the larger patches, those shown in blue here, only about 7% are larger than 100 square kilometers. The impact that roads have on their surrounding landscape goes far beyond the roads themselves. Direct and indirect impacts of roads include things like habitat loss and fragmentation, chemical pollution, noise disturbance, increased wildlife mortality due to car collisions, changes in population gene flow, and the facilitation of biological invasions. As we saw on the last slide, roads have been cut through ecosystems all over the world, fragmenting them into ever smaller pieces, which has had adverse effects on biodiversity. We know that the smaller the habitat patch and the less connected it is to other patches, the fewer species it can support. And the populations that can be supported are often at risk of inbreeding depression, making them less adaptable and more at risk of extinction. Roads will also alter the chemical composition of their surrounding area through runoff and emissions, which leads to changes in the vegetation that can grow in the area. The plants that colonize roadsides are typically fast-growing species that can handle stressful and frequently disturbed environments. They're also generally highly adaptable and good competitors. Think about the plants you see along the side of the road. Dandelion, clover, hawkweed, thistle, things like that. Although roadside plants can be a diverse bunch, you generally see the same set of species all along roadsides across North America, even in areas where the native plant communities are quite different. This is in part because roads are often the pathway that plants use to move across regions, their seeds carried and deposited along the roads by vehicles. However, this process favors aggressive invasive species like purple loosestrife, which are able to quickly colonize a new area and outcompete native species. Roads also affect aquatic environments, altering their chemical composition through runoff and disrupting water circulation patterns, which can affect the movement of aquatic species. The microclimate around the road differs from the surrounding area. The black road surface absorbs heat, making it hotter than the surrounding area, which can then end up attracting ectothermic animals like frogs and snakes, which will bask on the road, making them a target to become potential roadkill. The orientation of the road also has an effect on things like wind speed, turbulence, and relative humidity, which can alter air movement patterns. Roads also have numerous effects on wildlife. There is the direct hazard of wildlife vehicle collisions, which is the leading cause of death among vertebrates on land, killing hundreds of millions of animals each year. But roads can also alter wildlife behavior and movement patterns, as some species will go to great lengths to avoid roads because of the associated noise, visual disturbance, and associations with general harm. Many animals will become stressed out in the presence of roads, which interferes with their daily activities. And if road densities are high enough, this avoidance could result in wildlife not being able to reach key pieces of their habitat, eventually altering their distribution and potentially even lowering their population viability. In general, roads do not significantly impact strong populations of habitat generalists like raccoons and sparrows, but they can have a significant impact on threatened or endangered habitat specialists like the Florida panther or the Blanding's turtle. Local populations of a species may also suffer declines if roadkill rates exceed the rates of reproduction or immigration. For example, the mainland moose population in Nova Scotia is threatened in part because high road densities have cut off subpopulations from each other, and there are high rates of roadkill in the Chignecto Isthmus around the New Brunswick border. The outer spatial limit of all of these impacts that roads have is called the road effect zone. The exact size of the road effect zone is dependent on a number of factors, including the size and traffic volume of the road, the type of ecosystem surrounding the road, and the suite of wildlife present in the area. In general, the greater the road width and traffic density, the more likely it is to be a barrier, and the larger the road effect zone. Asphalt paved roads also tend to be more of a barrier than gravel roads, though this may be because gravel roads tend to be smaller roads with less traffic. Roads surrounded by dense forests typically have a smaller road effect zone than those surrounded by open grasslands because the sightlines for wildlife are shorter. Individual species also all have their own road effect zone based on how sensitive they are to the presence of roads. Some species, like the woodland caribou, are highly sensitive to the presence of roads and will alter their behavior up to 17 kilometers away from even small roads. Others, like bobcats, are far less affected by roads and have a much smaller road effect zone. In general, research has indicated that a road effect zone of 1 kilometer will capture the effects roads have on most birds, and a road effect zone of 5 kilometers captures the response to roads by most mammals. There are a number of measures that can be taken to promote safe road crossings for wildlife, including signage and lights, fencing, underpasses, and overpasses. It is important to note, though, that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to road mitigation measures, as some species will only cross out in the open, while other species will only cross through enclosed passageways. Therefore, it's not uncommon to mix and match different mitigation measures in order to provide for a variety of species. Let's look at each of these different mitigation measures in more detail. Of all the measures we will look at today, signage and lights are the most cost-effective. These measures are more focused on human behavior and work to alert drivers to where wildlife crossings may occur. However, there are questions as to how well these signs actually work in practice. Although they are frequently used and are relatively inexpensive, they tend to be ignored by drivers, and research has shown that up to 60% of drivers do not even notice wildlife warning signs, especially if they are on a road they frequently travel on. Fencing along major roads like highways can be used to funnel wildlife towards certain places for crossing, making their movements along busy roads more predictable, and they are often used in conjunction with other mitigation measures like signage or underpasses. When properly maintained on both sides of the road, fencing can cut wildlife vehicle collisions in half because crossing locations are intentionally chosen to be in areas where drivers should have a good view of any animals. The gates and the fences, like the one shown here, are generally placed on long, straight sections of the road rather than on potentially blind corners. However, there are some ecological factors that make it difficult to adopt fencing as a blanket solution. Because fencing can impact normal animal travel patterns, if not done carefully, it can unintentionally result in separating populations, which is why it is important to try and place the gates as close to hotspot areas where wildlife often cross before fences were put up. Fencing long stretches of road can also be expensive, as it generally costs somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 per kilometer, and their maintenance costs can also be significant. Wildlife underpasses are structures that allow for wildlife to travel underneath the road, avoiding wildlife vehicle collisions altogether, making it safer for both people and wildlife. Building these structures typically costs between $200,000 and $400,000, though costs can be brought down if underpasses are part of the initial construction of the road. Wildlife overpasses are similar to underpasses, except they allow for wildlife to cross over top of the road. They are also the most expensive of the road mitigation options, with each one costing somewhere between $2 and $4 million, or 10 times the cost of an underpass, or 100 times the cost of a kilometer of wildlife fencing. To maximize their effectiveness, both underpasses and overpasses are often placed close together and in conjunction with fencing, which funnels wildlife towards the structures. Some species like black bear and cougars prefer to use the shadowy tunnels of underpasses, while other species like grizzlies and most ungulates prefer to cross in the open sightlines of overpasses. Canada's first under and overpass structures were built in Banff National Park in 1997, including the one shown here. Early on, a lot of biologists and citizens were quite skeptical of the project. Many people believed that it was a waste of taxpayer dollars to build structures that wildlife would never use. Others thought they would be used by wolves and other carnivores to easily pick off prey. However, over 20 years of data has suggested that the project was a success, and more under and overpass structures have been constructed in the mountain parks. Among large carnivores like wolves and grizzly bears, mortality rates are 50 to 100% lower along the stretches of highway with the structures compared to those without. Research has also shown that virtually all of the wildlife species in the area will use the structures, with over 200,000 crossings being captured on camera, including by species that were expected to be too sensitive to roads to ever use them, like wolverine and lynx. Regardless of which mitigation measure or measures are chosen, it is important to consider the local context of the road and to identify as many of the current patterns of wildlife movement as possible in order to determine where to best place these measures, because they are expensive to build, so we want to ensure that they end up being placed in the best place possible.